Hello, assalamu alaikum everybody. Hope you're all safe, sound, and healthy. And we're going to talk about some random topics here and there. But let's begin with the most obvious that everybody always wants that somebody should talk about, despite the fact that let's face it. Number one, lack of actual information, and number two, I am not right now in the field. I've been out of the field for quite a while, so but yes, of course, that doesn't mean that I am blind. We all have eyes, and then we all have brains, and then we all have to be able to, multiply two by two and then get the answer. It's four. So here we have the two by two and four. Kashmir, the Kashmir issue. As we know, India has already taken so many steps to basically strip Kashmir of its independence, of its civil rights, of its status. And keep that in mind that the Pakistani army did not challenge that. Okay? In fact, they basically stepped back, which is a betrayal. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I'm going to move on to the next point, which we all know, and that is the attacks. Now, the attacks in Kashmir right now is something that the Kashmiris were, you could say, they kind of predicted it because for more than a year now, at least for a year, everybody related to, concerned with, and pertaining to the media industry in Kashmir and the political industry. They have been voicing their concerns. They have been constantly mentioning this fact that India, under the training of Mossad, is following Israeli steps. And the exact same thing that Israel is doing in Palestine is being done in Kashmir by the Indian government. In the name of tourism, the Indian government is sending flocks and flocks of preferably Hindu dominated tourists. They're encouraging them to go to Kashmir. And you must have seen there are a lot of these Hindu Indian vloggers that have been suddenly making way too many trips to Kashmir this past year, and you're like, what the heck? What the heck is going on here? Well, that is what was going on here. The Indian government was literally creating this whole, tourism, alleged tourism, in order to dominate Kashmir. And then at the same time, it was, it's basically proceeding to colonization, full colonization and integration of Kashmir into India. And then they also encouraged these so called tourists to go and buy lands in Kashmir and settle there. Basically, India's government is trying that there should be an influx of Hindu population in Kashmir so that the increasing number of Hindu population could make it easier for India to fully colonize Kashmir and strip the Muslims of their land. Well, India is already trying to strip the Muslims of their land. They have actually begun the process of stripping the Muslims, the natives of Kashmir, of their land. And they have been snatching the land. They have been forcing them to sell their lands for literally pennies. And, they've been killing people, as you know, those who refuse. They've been demolishing houses. They've been doing all of that. The same thing that's been going on in Palestine has been going on in Kashmir. And now this latest facade by the Indian government, this false flag operation, this Pahalgam attack in Kashmir. And here we are. And then suddenly, India now decides that, let's drag Pakistan once again into it, because India's politics is not complete without Pakistan. India has this obsession with Pakistan. And this obsession is not going to go away. Not for a long time. Not until not until two things are settled. First, Pakistan's sovereignty, and second, the Kashmir issue. And it can only be done in this way. The exact same way as I'm saying. First, Pakistan needs to remove all the traitors and re-strengthen its sovereignty. Only and only if and when Pakistan becomes an actual sovereign state can it do something about the sovereignty of Kashmir. So that means if Kashmir wants to be a completely separate independent sovereign state, it should be given the right to. If it wants to integrate itself into Pakistan, it should be given the right to. Okay, so this is how it's supposed to be. But again, now remember what I said at the beginning. When India revoked the status of Kashmir, the Pakistani government and army did nothing. They literally backed off. And they basically agreed with the Indian government's whole move. They literally agreed with them. They did not dispute it. You understand? So for India to go ahead and try and drag Pakistan in, you can see that this is a long stretch. And you can see it's very political, very, very political, because Modi's whole political career is based on anti-Islam and anti-Pakistan. Without that, he cannot survive, because he caters to the extremist Hindu clans of India, and he caters to the terrorist extremist Hindu clans of India. Remember the massacre in Gujarat. Remember that he directly had a hand in it. So Hindu extremism and terrorism has always been rampant in India under his governance. They've done it against Christians, they've done it against Sikhs, they've done it against Muslims, they've done it against anybody and everybody that's not a Hindu. So India was never a secular state, and it cannot be a secular state under his governance. Okay, so once that is clear, now we need to understand here what is going on. Okay, so the water treaty. This is again a reminder of what I've always been saying, that remember, India is not in love with Kashmir. The only reason India wants to keep a hold on Kashmir is water. It's literally water. It's the lifeline. If the whole of Kashmir comes to Pakistan, then a huge percent of water issues can be resolved for Pakistan. And even if Kashmir becomes an independent state, still a huge percentage of that issue can be resolved. Whereas in India, it doesn't matter how many dams they make, it doesn't matter what they do, they will not be able to control the water. Because remember, water falls from high to low, it doesn't go from low to high. And at the high point is Kashmir. So yes, I know that Kashmir is not the only, but it is the main source. You have to keep that in mind. It is, at the end of the day, one of the main sources. Now, that's not to say that Pakistan does not have its own sources. It does. But remember, at one point, some sources of water, they connect, they align, they join. So it's from one that they divide into 3 or 4 different rivers. So anyway, anybody and everybody who knows about the water issue, they know what I'm talking about. I don't even want to go into details. The point is, India cannot afford to have a full-blown war with Pakistan, but India is basically trying to once again dominate. And why is it doing that? For its own political status, for Modi's own political status. On the other hand, you know that America has been edging for conflicts in all the regions possible, India, Pakistan, because any and every conflict in any and every region that can touch the borders of those countries that America is literally itching for a war with, those countries cannot stay in peace. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if soon North Korea and South Korea will have a skirmish. And you will know that America will be behind that too. But again, America or no America, the point is India is always itching for a fight as well. It's always trying to dominate Pakistan. It's always trying to make Pakistan think that, oh, you know what, we need you, but we are forcing you to help us. That's the attitude. It's the same attitude that America has been showing us. They need us, but they want to force us to do what they want. When you want somebody to do something for you, you need to humbly ask that person for their help or cooperation. But when you try to dominate the other person, which is the American way and which is the Indian way, then this is where things can go south. So there are other reasons too, which are, again, politically motivated, but I'm not going to go into those because they're very obvious, very psychologically obvious reasons. But yeah, okay, the 2 major reasons that the world needs to concern itself with is the fact that India is basically trying to further hasten its move towards colonization of Kashmir, right? And nothing is complete without throwing Pakistan into the mix. Okay, so that is basically a sort of a in a way, it's a kind of a an offensive defense also. Call it that. Okay, it's an offensive defense by India, where it's taking no risks of Pakistan moving forward in that attack, or Pakistan coming forward and saying, oh, India literally did a false flag operation there, although Pakistan is not at all interested in doing that, because remember, right now the Pakistani government is itself doing much the same to its own people. But just again, I guess just for show, or just to, not take chances, the Indian government decided to use this as a warning gesture to stop Pakistan before it can even react towards this whole false flag operation that India just did in Kashmir. Because as I said, Kashmir has very openly declared that this is a false flag operation by the Indian government to basically give the Indian government more of an excuse to further amp up its aggressive colonization of Kashmir. Okay? And remember, we're not in Kashmir. They're the ones who are in Kashmir. If they predicted the situation and they read the situation, they know it better. Okay? So we cannot argue with them on this point, especially when the people concerned are people who are literally on the ground, and these are people who were expecting many such atrocities to be committed on their land by the Indian government. So it comes as no surprise to them, and this is why they have been very vocal in that. Coming to that now, we move on to the next, and that is Pakistan, as usual, always keeping its borders open and not breaking its promise and oath regarding the, for example, the Sikh pilgrimage and the influx of, Indian visitors and all. So where on one hand, India has always created problems for Pakistani tourists and in visa processes, but Pakistan has not been that difficult with especially the Sikh pilgrims or the Punjabis that need to move from India to Pakistan in for either religious purposes or for business purposes or for tourism purposes. But yes, in both countries there is always a restriction. There's just a number of places that you can and cannot go. That is with both in both cases. But I do think that Pakistan also, just for the sake of safety, needs to also close right now its borders and effectively politely request the Indian tourists to go back to India just to stay on the safe side. Yes, there are way too many Indian tourists in Pakistan, believe it or not, especially currently, and I'm frankly wondering why. To be honest, I have no problems with the Punjabi tourists because I know why they're here. They're always coming and going for the religious purposes, but there has recently been a bit too many Indian vloggers and tourists in Pakistan, and I think it would be safe for them to leave because you don't know what the Indian government can do to their own people on Pakistan soil just in order to aggravate the situation, if you know what I mean. So one should take no chances because India is going to try to do what it did just a few years back when it targeted a number of Pakistani civilians claiming that they were terrorists. And so they transgressed, they violated our space when they literally sent the missiles through, killing those people. So, you can expect any such movement from India just to create. Remember, as I said, India has this thing that it wants to keep on and on showing its dominance over Pakistan, despite the fact that it really is wasting its time and money and energy and efforts in that. If the Indian government would spend all of that time, energy, and efforts and money on actually working on its own country's problems and issues, that would be much wiser. And you could actually get some progress. So now what else was it that we were supposed to talk about? Yes, the next thing that's on my mind is completely different from all of this in a way. The only relation to do with it is probably language. Okay, so now we're coming to languages. There is this YouTube channel, Word Friends, and currently, just recently, in the past few days, up until yesterday, they were doing this new series in which they were showing the relationship between Urdu, Turkish, and Middle Eastern languages, basically Arabic, Arabic and Persian. And I thought that was very interesting. In fact, I was very pleasantly surprised that there is somebody who actually has such in-depth knowledge of the fact that Urdu, of how Urdu was formed, how Urdu was created, and how these other languages were incorporated into it. And I thought that that was actually very, very and it was a very nice idea behind the whole series of tracing what words originate from which language, and and also how Turkish and Arabic integration occurred during the Ottoman Empire, and how Persian and Arabic integration also occurred. And so they were doing it on a very lighter note, the way they usually do it, where they have these few people and they sit and then they just discuss, oh, we say this in our language, we say this in our language, this is how we say this sentence, this is how we say this sentence. And it's very fun and interesting and light. But what I found very, very, very amusing is that the comments below it were, especially the latest, in their latest, where there was a Turkish girl and a Pakistani girl, and they were both seeing what words they do have in common in the two languages. And the Arab girls were also in between identifying some words that, yeah, oh yeah, these are also similar to words used in our language and stuff like that. And the comments below were from so-called self-declared language professors and so-called language historians. And the fact that I found it really funny is that they were all too busy trying to show who they were and what they know, at the same time dissing the whole series. And I would say that, as a language coach myself, and as a language teacher myself, and as somebody who has also taught in universities, and I'm thinking, you people are so, I mean, you're just proving your ignorance, actually. The fact that you're basically just, you know, dick measuring. Seriously, that's all the comments, the people in the comments were doing, in my opinion. All they were doing were basically showing their narcissistic self and trying to, one up, and as to, oh, we are this and we are that, and you're so stupid and you don't know anything, and what kind of a series is this, and what kind of a vlog is this, and, I mean, I think they just showed how, I mean, especially if one of them who claimed to be a language professor, you're a language professor and you don't even know of the different, as a language professor, he kept insisting that Urdu is an Indo-European language. Well, Indo-European language is a very vast, larger range, but Urdu is essentially an Indo-Aryan language. And in fact, Karaboli, from which the basic Urdu originates, Karaboli was a language that was again mainly Middle Indo-Aryan, and it was spoken in Delhi and its regions around. And because at that time the Mughals political seat was in Delhi, this is why when they formed Urdu, they used Karaboli as their basic. And then, there's somebody who's saying, no, Urdu stems from Vedic, and somebody who's saying, no, Urdu stems from Indo-European. And look, the point is, Urdu basically stems from Karaboli, which in turn is an Indo-Aryan language. Okay, when you when the Indians, when they got their independence and they realized that Urdu had already been taken by the Pakistanis, because it was always basically the language of the Indian Muslims. Remember, the Indian Muslims always had one language that united them. First it was Persian. When they dropped Persian, they took over Urdu. But the rest of the India, the non-Muslim part of India, they didn't have any such concept of unifying themselves under one language. This was a Muslim concept. And so, but because of the popularity of Urdu, which was then called Hindustani, the popularity of it it was so much, especially during the British times as well, because it was an easy language to understand and to speak. Well, hello, that is why the Mughals made Urdu, so that it should be easy to communicate with each other. Morons. Anyway, the point is, and I'm summarizing this, okay? So the point is that the British, because they also found it so much more easier to use and communicate in Urdu, so they, continued to use it, and it became more and more popular. And as a result, after Pakistan got its independence and Urdu was made its national language, India, left behind with an independence a day later, realized that actually it didn't have one unifying language to call its own. And because of the immense popularity of Urdu, obviously they could not take Urdu and say, oh, no, Urdu is ours, because it was already taken, copyrights. And so they decided, oh, no, right, we'll have Hindi. We'll call it Hindi, from Hindustani, obviously. So, and they decided we'll call it Hindi. And what they did is that they replaced the bulk of the words that made Urdu. Okay? And those were the Arabic, Persian, and Turkish words. They replaced them by their Vedic Sanskrit words. And so now they always try to, India actually acts like Israel, like how Israel brings in these Palestinian dishes and say, oh, these are Israeli dishes. So soon I wouldn't be surprised if one day Israel suddenly starts speaking Arabic, the Israelis, and they will say, oh, originally Arabic was our language. We just left it and began with Hebrew, but we're now going back to our roots, so we're going to have Arabic because that is our original language. Yeah, that's the exact same thing you'll soon find India. India is already kind of doing that. India has already, tried to say that so many dishes are Indian, which obviously now even the international chefs all over the world have come to realize that no, these are not Indian dishes. They're Pakistani dishes, but you can't really call them Indian dishes. Because again, these are dishes that were introduced by the Muslims, the Muslim rulers, the Muslim communities in India. Okay, so they're not native to India, but it is more likely for them to be native to Pakistan because the regions in which these dishes were introduced were mainly those regions that have fallen into Pakistan. So historically, these are Pakistani dishes, So, and we're talking about essentially meat-oriented dishes, okay? India is not a meat-eating country. I mean, Hindus are supposed to be vegetarians. So how can they say, oh, these dishes are Indian? So I mean, that just shows you the mindset. It's the mindset of people when they want to say, oh, just because India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh were one. But again, here I have to remind them, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan were not always one. They were made one by the Muslim rulers. It was the Muslim rulers that united the whole of India, But India was never one before that. These were all separate, small, warring states. They were united under the Muslims. So India needs to remind itself of that, when it goes. But the point is that, as we know, India has been notorious for changing its history too. So why not change the history of Urdu as well and claim that, oh, it belongs to ancient Vedic script? The Urdu was, I'm sorry, but anyway. But I mean, that is on one side, you have people who are constantly saying, oh, why don't you, compare Urdu with Hindi because they're close. And then there are others, the Turkish, who are saying, oh, why don't you, instead of comparing Turkish with Middle Eastern languages and other languages, you should compare Turkish with Turkic and others. But see, that's where you people literally have just, you've just exposed your ignorance. You've literally just exposed your ignorance right here. Because why would anyone want to compare Turkish with Turkic language when we all know it's one family? We already know that. Similarly, why would you want to compare Urdu with Hindi when we know that Hindi stems from Urdu? Like it or not, Indians, but Hindi essentially stems from Urdu. You may like to go very technical on your part and say, oh no, because it's essentially one language and then it branched and it did this and it did that, whatever. The point is, essentially, when it was even one language, it was Urdu. Okay? It was never Hindi. Okay? The British called it Hindustani, but it is Urdu. Just because the world right now calls Urdu Pakistani, that doesn't make it Pakistani. It is still Urdu. You call Urdu by any other name, but it's still Urdu. Okay? Call Urdu Hindustani, but it's still Urdu. call Urdu Pakistani, it's still Urdu. Okay. Now you decided to call Urdu Hindi, and obviously because you knew that at the end of the day it is still Urdu, the only way you could make it Hindi was remove and replace all those words that make it uniquely Urdu and replace them with your Vedic Sanskrit scripts and vocabulary and whatever. Why? Because there's so many words in Urdu that you cannot even pronounce. You can't even pronounce the p because it's not in your language, it's not in your dialect. You can't pronounce z because it's not in your language, it's not in your dialect. You can't pronounce j because it's not in your language and it's not in your dialect. These are all uniquely Urdu. And that is why Hindi stems from Urdu, because the original language that was created by the Mughals, Urdu, was heavily incorporated with Arabic, Turkish, and Persian words, with the base of it being Karabuli. Okay, and this is essentially why, even though you may try to go again into this whole realm of saying, oh, it's one of the Indo-European languages, but at the end of the day, when you have to define Urdu, you would not define it as an Indo-European language. I'm sorry, but you will always define it as an Indo-Aryan language. You can put that under the larger umbrella of Indo-European, but when you're defining it again, when you're defining something, it means you have to be very specific. When you're being specific, you have to call it for its own specifics, and specifically it is Indo-Aryan. Okay? And there is no dispute there. So just trying to make yourself correct and saying, no, it is Indo-European. Yeah. Who cares about your Indo-European? You do realize that Indo-European, again, as I said, is a larger umbrella. We're down to specifics. Indo-Aryan. Period. So, this is, the kind of people that you see commenting under, where they've actually lost. It reminds me of the time where, when I was doing my master's in England in script writing and production. And there was this famous, stage play writer, and he had written a stage play, theater, and it was, our teacher had given us the script, and because we were supposed to, talk about it or discuss it or whatever, and because the teacher, the author was going to come and do a sort of a lecture too as well with us. And I was even surprised, and so was my teacher, that the first thing that my class fellows started doing was critically analyzing and saying, oh, we think that in this line the writer meant this, and we think that the actual meaning and concept behind the whole drama and the stage play is actually this. And the teacher and I were looking at each other, and she's like, we're not discussing the idea behind the stage play because the idea is very obvious, and we've already told you what the idea is because he's already mentioned the idea behind a stage play. The whole bloody world knows the idea behind the drama, behind the story. Everybody knows what it is. You're not here to bring your own variety of, analysis and say, oh, we think this is what he means. You don't need to think what he means because he's already told you what he means, This is exactly the kind of stupidity that was going on in the comment section of this series, where everybody was literally, just measuring their dicks. Mine is larger, yours larger. Oh, they're so stupid. Oh, they don't know what they're doing. Yeah, actually, you just showed that you're so stupid that you don't know what they're doing, okay? Even when you do a PhD, you know that you pick just one little idea, one strain from a subject, and then you turn it into a whole thesis. Isn't that the whole idea? You take one very tiny aspect that is not explored, and you blow it up into a thesis, and you argue your points. So why is it that you people do not understand that this is a fact? It is actually a fact, one of the facts of the language history. The point that all languages, one way or the other, interconnect and meet at one point. That is the whole interesting fact. And the fact that you can actually define at one point some languages met. That is the interesting point. The fact that Urdu, Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, how they all converge, despite the fact that they're completely different languages. And if you speak Urdu, none of them can understand you. And if they speak their languages, a Pakistani cannot understand them. But when you literally get down to the actual words themselves, because the pronunciation is key, pronunciation is completely different as well because of the way we speak and our dialects and our regions. So if you write down the words, you can actually understand them. And sometimes even when you pronounce them, you can understand them because they're very close. But when you put them in sentences and when you put them in your own strain, then you cannot recognize it at all. And that is the fun part of languages. That is what any person who knows anything about language would automatically understand, that, oh yeah, that's exactly what they're, yeah, because anybody and everybody can relate to it. Because as a language teacher, when I teach somebody French, for example, unlike typical language teachers, I don't try to decipher French with English. In fact, I show exactly where it is completely opposite to English and exactly where it meets English. So where there's a connection between French and English, that is where I bring English. But where there is no connection whatsoever, I will not bring English at all. And that is why I always got 100% results when I taught French. Unlike typical teachers whom I've noticed that they always do that. They always bring in English when they teach French. Now, especially when you're teaching French to a Pakistani, you should never bring English because French is it's closer to Urdu. The grammar, the sentence formation, it's more close to, although French grammar is totally out of whack, because French grammar actually it has no direct relation with the spoken language, because actually French was originally a spoken language and it was later on that they turned it into a literary language. This is why there's this huge difference that you see between that is the why basically the grammar is allegedly complicated in French as opposed to when you're just speaking the language. But the amount of similarities that you find in French sentence formation, especially with Urdu, is much more closer, and it's the direct opposite, with regards to English. And this is exactly how Urdu is opposite of English too, because the way we write our sentences in Urdu is literally the opposite of how you write them in English. So pray tell, why would you insist on bringing English into the mix when you're teaching a Pakistani or an Indian French? That's where you spoil it for them, actually. That's how you make it complicated. And this is why I say that these people who were in the comment sections, they knew jack shit while they were so busy trying to trace. I mean, again, I would say it. Why would you want to compare Hindi with Urdu? We already know that Urdu was the original language and Hindi branched out of it. And I will keep on repeating that Hindi branched out of Urdu. Why? Because the original Urdu, the original Lashkari Zaban, had a heavy mix of Karaboli, obviously being the base, and then Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. Whereas Hindi removed all of that made Urdu Urdu, and replaced that with Sanskrit and Ved. And now they're trying to argue that Urdu was originally Sanskrit and Ved. I mean, that is just so stupid. It's Hindi. Hindi is. And that is what makes these two languages different. But again, as I said, you cannot compare these two languages because, again, one comes from the other. They are essentially both from the same language, which is Urdu. Urdu remained Urdu, while Hindi became Hindi as it branched out of Urdu. So why would you want to compare that? And the whole world knows that Hindi comes from Urdu, And then there were those, again, who were saying that, oh, you should compare the language. Why would you want to compare languages that belong to the same family? Comparison means comparing two completely seemingly different languages and then tracing their roots to find similarities. That is what is called comparison. As so-called linguists and so-called language professors and so-called people who know the history of the language, you failed to actually realize this very, very commonsensical basic knowledge. You don't even know the meaning of comparison. Obviously, I'm going to compare Turkish with Urdu or Urdu with Persian, because the whole point is that these are completely different languages that seem to have nothing in common with each other. And yet, hey presto, look at the vocabulary. They have the vocabulary that is in common with each other. In some forms, Persian and Urdu have grammar in common with each other. That is what we call comparison. When you compare two things that seem to have nothing in common and you find out that there is a common strain, and then you trace the roots as to why there is that common strain. It is, in fact, this very, very notion that gave birth to the whole idea of having Indo-European and Indo-Aryan. How do you think we coined these terms? What the hell do you think made us coin these terms? When we started saying, oh, this language is actually Indo-European, what do you think we're saying when we're saying these languages have nothing to do with each other, but they have common originating strains, they have common originating vocabulary, they have common originating points. They are coming from a certain similar root. They're stemming and branching out from one source. That is why we say Indo-European. That's why we say Indo-Aryan, because we're showing how languages from these two regions mixed and melanged and collaborated into these new different languages. And why that is why you see that the fact that they are completely different from each other, but they seem to have similar origins. And this is exactly how you get to coin these terms, is when you see how completely different languages that have completely different even characteristics, how and when and why did they seem to share a certain origin or a certain source. And that is a fun, and again, as I said, learning languages where you understand. For example, when I listen to Japanese and Korean and Chinese, I find a lot of words, even in their own languages, even though their languages are completely different from each other, but you will see similarities. Why? Because they share words of the same origin at one point. Even Japanese have certain Chinese origin words that they use. And notice that these origins that we use in all these languages are mainly the form of nouns. That's another fun fact I've noticed. When I noticed Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, and then I noticed also Turkish, Urdu, Persian, Arabic, it's the nouns that we seem to share. Have you noticed that? Even if you look at the Indo-European languages, the origins that we seem to share are heavily in the nouns area, which means the naming of objects. It's not the verbs as much. But yes, in the European languages, you will see that at times it's also the verbs. But if you look at the Indo-European or Indo-Aryan, you would notice that it's heavily around the nouns, the subjects, the objects. And so again, you see, these are the little fun things that you connect. And then you realize that, oh, wow. And then you begin to wonder, how did all these languages that sound completely different from each other, how and when and why did they begin to sound completely different from each other? What made those words become those words? When people started speaking, what was it that made them decide that this word sounds better for this object, or this verb is the right word to use in order to express this form of action? I mean, I have gone to those lengths even, for different languages. As a writer, as a teacher, as a language teacher, as a language coach, as somebody who has really loved languages and literally spent half of my life prodding these interesting points of different languages. I find that the people who claim to know about languages literally don't. I'm beginning to wonder if they just roted through their studies, to become whatever it is that they claim to become. Because if they don't even recognize these little nuances and these little connections, then I'm sorry, they do not deserve to even talk about whatever it is that they want to talk about regarding languages in any platform, let alone in the comment section of a forum that is actually doing something legit. I mean, you're just arguing a point because that is a technical point that you're running away with. But you running away with only one technical point actually exposes your ignorance to the fact that you don't even know how languages were formed and the connections between the languages and how we trace origins of completely different languages and find the similar source. How stupid can you people be? That's that's what I get away with. I mean, that is what I have literally, you know come to. I mean, that is what is coming to my mind, seriously, when I read those comments of those people. I'm like, how stupid are you? You're calling the person who made the series stupid, but you're literally the stupid ones, because this is actually a historical fact. Even, I mean, anybody and everybody who knows Urdu, we always know that yes, Urdu was a Lashkari Zaban. It was created by the Mughals. Their seat was in Delhi. The main language that was used in Delhi was Kharaboli, which was a Middle Indo-Aryan language, and using that as a base, they formulated this new language in which they wanted that all the different ethnic members of the military should be able to communicate in one language that they all understood. And because they all had completely different separate ethnic backgrounds, it was difficult for them to communicate. So it was better that they just formed one language that they could all mutually understand. And that is why this Urdu was formed. And now people are talking about Vedic and Sanskrit, and then people are talking about Turkic, it should be compared with the Turkish, and some people are talking about Hindi should be compared with Urdu. And I mean, that was so stupid. Again, why would you compare languages that the whole world already knows that they belong to the same group? Why would you want to compare Turkish with Turkic when they are literally one family? We already know they're one family. They're one group. You don't compare things that belong to the same genus or the same species. You're comparing things that seemingly have no relationship with each other, and then you find out that they actually have a relationship with each other. And then you find the interesting history of how it was formed. So yeah, it just showed a lack of understanding. As I said, it reminded me of how my class fellows, acted as well when we had that stage play, that theater script in front of us, and they were like, "Oh, I think the writer meant this," and "Oh, I think the writer was trying to say that because he used this word." The writer couldn't have been any more obvious. The whole freaking world knew what the writer was trying to say. The writer himself had already made it very clear that this is what his story was about. This is what it was, the theme. This is the subject. This is the backstory. And yet they were bringing on their own. No, and they were still arguing. They were still arguing, even though the teacher was also like, we're not even talking about this. This is not what we're talking about. They're like, no, but this is exactly what these people in the comment section were doing also. They just kept on arguing. And you know that you're dealing with a stupid person when that person keeps on arguing. Yeah. Well, this is me signing out. Khuda Hafiz.